Hello, welcome to Law Excellence. I am Harsha Mannava and we are discussing this book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. So, we now come to the last part of this book. We discussed cognitive revolution, we discussed agriculture revolution and the changes in human life, human culture, the changes in economy, political system and religious sphere that agriculture caused. Today, from the next few videos will be on scientific revolution. So we said human story could broadly be, it's a huge story of enormously big time scale, but we can bring it down to three events: cognitive revolution, agriculture revolution and scientific revolution. From today, from this video, we will take up scientific revolution and we begin with this chapter called the discovery of ignorance. Very interesting, right? That we discovered ignorance. Let's see what we mean by this. So, scientific revolution began only about 1500, around 1500 years. It's only 500 years. But compared to the age of Homo sapien, which is nearly 2 lakh years, 500 years is a minuscule, isn't it? Hardly anything. But humankind has seen huge change in this last 500 years compared to what it had seen in the preceding lakhs of years. Just take a look, and behind this rapid, enormous change, what is the one underlying factor? That is scientific revolution. It brought huge changes, and not just the enormity of change, even the pace of change started being rapid. So one, it changed everything, the way we lived in all spheres was impacted. Second, the pace at which our culture began to change, how the pace at which we began to embrace new ideas, new technologies, all of that went through huge push. Just take a look at this table, before and after. Before scientific revolution, the population of Homo sapiens was about 500 million. But after that, today we are about 7 billion. And the total GDP of the world was only about $250 billion. Today it is $60 trillion. Earlier, we just had some small books. Even books were few and far-fetched in number. Having a book was some kind of a status symbol and only the elite could afford them. But today, forget books, we have computers, digitization, terabytes and petabytes of information that we are struggling to store and analyze. And medicine, if you were sick, it was assumed because the gods were angry with you or because they would have some traditional herbal medicine which they would feed you. But today, in medicine, in the sphere of medicine, we made rapid changes. We discovered pills, the antibiotics. From pill, we are moving towards cell, that is genetically modified treatment, gene therapies. We are able to grow organs, we are able to make changes at cellular level and heal our diseases. We are able to modify our immune system. So much change thanks to biotechnology. But of course, nothing, while all these events showed the strength of science and showed how much we could shape our own future and our own history, two events were remarkable in terms of human capacity for change. The first was man's landing on Mars. Through that event, humans demonstrated that they could transcend the boundaries of this planet. And of course, the second event showed that humans also did not have just the strength to create positive impact, but they also had the capability to destroy this planet, that is through the atomic bomb that was discovered, that was tested in 1945 by the team led by Robert Oppenheimer. So these are the pinnacles or a brief overview of the ability or the enormous changes that scientific revolution brought about. But it's not like science. What is science? How is it different from earlier knowledge systems? People always had knowledge. Science is not the first time that people had knowledge. But science is different from earlier knowledge systems. Earlier knowledge systems used to be called as tradition. They used to be in the form of the Vedas in India, the Bible, the Quran, various scriptures, or they used to be spread in the form of some religious beliefs, some myths. All of these traditional sources were the forms of earlier knowledge. But science is different. How is it different? With science, what is, if you have to ask the question, what is the one important thing about scientific revolution that made it so relevant to all of us? If I have to tell you what is the most important thing, it is humans, beginning with scientific revolution, began to accept that we do not know. So the simple accepting the fact, the simple act of accepting that we do not know was the foundation on which so much of human progressive knowledge was built. Until that point of time, humans were sure, in fact, if we may use the word hubris, they had hubris and some amount of arrogance that they knew the world because the God they believed in was omnipotent and omniscient. He knew everything. And since God gave them a message, they, as his devout followers, also knew everything. So they believed they knew everything. Whatever they did not know was probably not worth knowing. That's the attitude humans had. But beginning with scientific revolution, humans admitted their ignorance. They said, we don't know. There is so much knowledge and we probably do not know it. So since we do not know, what is the next step? When you do not know, what do? Initially you may be worried, you may be scared, but then you overcome those emotions and you start trying to discover, fine, I don't know. So let me go about discovering, let me go about trying to find out what I don't know. And in trying to find out, they relied on observation, collection of data collection, and then they used mathematics, the science of mathematics, to analyze, compile and understand the observations they compiled. And once they developed these sophisticated tools of knowledge acquisition, they began using these to gain even more knowledge. More knowledge meant more power. So these are the three things that define scientific revolution. The most important thing is that people, Homo sapiens, learned to accept with enormous humility, we do not know. That's why when somebody tells you it's very important to not know what you don't know, that's very true. It's very important to identify what you don't know than to try to list out what you all know, because knowing what you don't know makes you a humble person. It makes you seek out knowledge and seek out help. So that's exactly what humans did around 500 years ago, and that gave rise to scientific revolution. So scientific revolution is indeed a revolution of ignorance, and this ability to admit ignorance gave rise to made humans inquisitive and made them replace their previous knowledge systems. What were the previous knowledge systems? Traditions like the Gita, the Vedas, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Upanishads, or the Bible, all the Greek scriptures, all these Egyptian scriptures, all these ancient systems of knowledge were slowly being put aside. Maybe people stuck to them for some spiritual insights, but in terms of dealing with the real physical world, they stuck to science. For the metaphysical, they would refer to scriptures. That's how people began to consciously, deliberately separate the physical world, the metaphysical world. Physical world, science is a better way of understanding it. Metaphysical world, yes, you can go to spiritual sources like religious books, but for physical world, science. And the attitude to have towards science is to accept that we don't know a lot. Only when we accept we don't know, we start trying to find out. And so science replaced dogma. Dogma is what we meant by the tradition, that God told us something and now we know what it is. That is called dogma. So science replaced dogma. And How could science replace dogma? How is it different from earlier systems of dogma? This is because at the center of science are these other methods that science uses. Science uses some research methods. These research methods gave science enormous credibility that made people accept it. What is this credibility? The source of this credibility is the use of mathematics, equations, graphs, calculations. The use of all these tools gave science clear edge over other systems. You just refer to your scriptures. Earlier traditions, they tried to impart some knowledge and some wisdom, but what was their source? They would used to use some stories like Panchatantra or Ramayana, Mahabharata. So the wisdom that they tried to impart was done in the form of stories. They would tell you a small story, and through that story you are supposed to know morals and values. But science was not like that. Its chief mode of communication was not storytelling. It said equations like this. Newton did not tell you a story of apple falling on his head. Newton understood all that and just gave you 3 equations. His enormous research was ultimately condensed into 3 mathematical equations. The presence of these mathematical equations and the certainty and precision that mathematics offers made people embrace science with increasing confidence and trust, because mathematics has no religion, has no God. Even you'll be shocked, some of the earliest contribution to science came from religious figures. If you don't believe me, let me give you some examples. Students of anthropology and genetics would have heard about Gregor Mendel, the good old Austrian monk. Mendel was the first person to discover some modern laws of genetics or modern laws of heredity. How would genes pass from one generation to another? What is the mechanism, underlying mechanism through which heredity operated? Mendel addressed this question, and he was an Austrian monk who was trained as a priest. But he studied the nature of inheritance through some experiments in the garden of his church, and he gave laws. Not just that, the earliest insurance, we are today using insurance, right? Even insurance was first made operational on a large scale by two religious people, 2 monks in London church. So these 2 monks initially, they wanted to solve this problem of women, widows and children of monks who died. Monks would take up risky occupations like going abroad to preach the message and all of that. Some of them used to have untimely death, leaving behind children and women. Now they wanted to solve the problem and improve the lives of these widows and children of the dead monks. So they said they came up with something like insurance, where the whole monk community would make small contributions to create a fund. The fund would be invested, and the returns on this fund could then be used to pay insurance, to give some monetary buffer, monetary security to those women and children who were left behind by the dead monks. But they were faced with a problem. How do we determine what is the contribution, what is the insurance premium, what is the contribution that each monk must pay in order for us to create a fund that can give us returns enough to pay for the people's insurance claims? So they needed 2 things. One, how much contribution should we take from each person first? Second, how many people, what is the rate, given the size of the monk community, in a given year, what is the death rate? How many people would die? They needed these 2 variables. Now they were clergymen. You would assume that they would go to the Christ and pray to him for answer, but ironically they didn't do that. They hired a young researcher who was trying to make a career in a recently emerging field. What was that field? Yes, it was statistics and probability. So these monks, when faced with the question of how to create this insurance fund and how to identify the 2 variables that are needed to make this fund work, did not resort to church, did not resort to religion for answers. They hired a mathematician, in particular a mathematician who was specializing in statistics and probability. And they devised a model, and that model was used to create this insurance, and this insurance went on to become the largest insurance company in London by the 20th century. So you see, over time, people, even religious persons, understood that they could not stick to their old dogma, that this new child on the road, this new kid on the block, science, had something special, and this speciality need to be embraced and not chided and not ignored. That's how science came to define our lives. And given this definition, of course, as science started developing and began showing its impact, Francis Bacon, a famous English novel writer, said, "Knowledge now is power." Why did he say that? Because those who controlled science, because modern science with its ability was creating so much technology, so many discoveries, so much understanding. So Francis Bacon immediately realized the potential of this and said, science generates knowledge, and knowledge is power. So science, knowledge, and those who have knowledge get power. What is the converse of this? Those who are in power will now try to gain command over knowledge, and to get command over knowledge, they will contribute to science, they will want to control science. So you see, knowledge is power. So power, those who are in power wanted to gain knowledge, and this led to some people trying to gather and control science. We'll discuss that soon. So, and soon this science and its knowledge, so those who are in power, the governments, started funding science, started sponsoring scientific research. And if you don't believe me, just look at World War I, World War II. These are two great wars that we fought in 20th century that defined the entire 20th century. But prior to that, even before this, we had many wars. The Chinese, the Mongols, we had Babur invading India. You had Napoleon, who conquered almost entire Europe even before Hitler tried it a century after him. So these early kings and early warriors had no interest in improving technology. When I said science is very important, science has enormous potential, soon those who are in power wanted to use science to improve their power by sponsoring scientific research in weaponry. The first use of science was in medicine, and all the next immediate use was in creating arms and weapons, so that each country, each king could use those weapons to gain more power. But this was not so in the preceding years. Kings like the Mongols, the armies like Mongols, Chinese emperors, even Indian emperors, the Napoleon, great kings like Napoleon, all of them achieved military success not because they had technological advantage over others. The victories of all these great warriors was largely based on their war skills, their war strategy. We hear the story of Babur defeating the Lodhis with a very small army. How could he do that? He had a better strategy. He dug trenches, he mobilized his army differently, he attacked from different sides. So in that sense, you would have seen this in Lord of the Rings. Even in the movie Lord of the Rings, the defense side, they're not technologically superior to the attackers, but they still win because of the better war strategy and better planning. So technology was never considered as a chief instrument which decided outcomes of war for a long time until the recent century. So kings and generals never thought of developing better advanced weaponry. They always thought of gathering more numbers, better planning, better strategy. But this all changed with the emergence of science on the scene. Once science came about, kings now began using science to generate weaponry and technology. And we saw this was going on for a while, but the outcome or the real extent to which this was being done was evident during the First and Second World Wars. In the First World War, there was what we call as trench warfare. You can see this recent movie called 1917. It shows this whole trench warfare. People are living in trenches, and the whole war came to a stalemate. When this was the situation, the rulers did not pray to God for answer. They called scientists, and using the advice of scientists, they came up with a solution. Similarly, World War II. What finally ended World War II? Yes, you all know it. It's the atomic bomb. Because by then, the Allies, the US, Britain, they had defeated Hitler. But the Japanese refused to surrender. They said, Japanese have this cultural tradition. They believe that it's better to commit suicide it's more honorable to commit suicide than to be caught by the enemy on the battlefield. So they would fight till the death. So the American president, now despite capturing Germany, despite Germany's surrender, Japan refused to surrender. The Japanese soldiers and army said, we will fight till the end. So the American president now knew that if he has to defeat Japan militarily, that means he will have to still fight on, though America is clearly powerful now. But they will still have to do the dirty work of fighting, and that means costing some American soldiers' lives. So that's when the American president, Harry Truman, signed the order that permitted the use of atomic bomb, and 2 atomic bombs were dropped in 2 Japanese cities within a span of 3 days, and the Japanese immediately surrendered. They realized, we can fight a war, but this bomb is something we cannot fight. They gave up. So in the earlier instance, they knew that America still was more powerful, but they still thought they could fight. But when they realized America had a technology that they had no clue about, that's when they finally gave up. So that's how knowledge is power, and those who are in power are now trying to gain control over knowledge. With all this science and power, human outlook also changed. Until scientific revolution, for a long time humans were living in some sort of pessimism, and their life was largely based on some sense of resignation. They accepted their fate. They thought, if my life was bad, it is because I had done some wrong. They used to think in things like humanity is condemned to live in suffering. So all these ideas of negativity, of passivity, of fatalism characterized human psyche. But come the idea of science, humans now believed, yes, we are not condemned to our fate. We can grasp our fate, we can shape our fate, that we can use this science to improve our lives. We can make progress. For example, for a long time, health, if somebody was ill, they said, what can we do? There was a famous king, Richard the Lionheart, the famous king of London, England. He had a small shot, he was shot by an arrow, pierced by an arrow on his shoulder, and he died of it. You will not believe it. Today, if that happens to any of us, we'll probably have, it's called a minor injury. There will be a quick treatment and we'll heal within a month and we'll be back and rolling. But something like that killed the great king of England. So modern medicine made people believe that they can fight diseases like malaria, smallpox, measles, plague, diphtheria. All these massive killers could be fought. So that was the first time humans believed, yes, we can take charge of our lives. Second, poverty. For a long time, people believed poverty, if somebody was poor, it was because of their fate, that they were condemned to be poor. There's nothing one can do about it. But come science and economics, the science of economics, we have people like Amartya Sen, Abhijit Banerjee, or Raghuram Rajan, the so-called development economists, Maqbul Hussain. All these development economists created the science of economics which enabled us to identify, yes, poverty is because of so and so reasons. If somebody is poor, we need to develop some anti-poverty measures based on our scientific understanding of poverty. So that's how you have PDS, you have NREGA, we are talking about universal basic income, cash transfers, free healthcare, Ayushman Bharat, all this came from science. So science also helped societies solve the problem of poverty. The developed world solved it. Countries like Sweden all have almost no poverty. Even if somebody is not working, they pay them unemployment allowance. But the developing world is improving and is still a few steps away from removing poverty. All this came because of science. Having done so much, science next moved to the next project, the Gilgamesh project. Some of you may have heard it, some may have not. This is the project which tries to cure the ultimate problem, that is death. So having solved so many other problems, science has now moved on, or it has taken upon the challenge of solving death. This may sound very arrogant, but science has got the courage and confidence, given its history of accomplishment, to even take on this ultimate problem that every man, woman, powerful, powerless, rich, poor has to go through. How is it able to do that? Earlier, in the past, humanity's approach to death was, if somebody is dying, that is because he has to go to the next world, merge with the God, his soul leaves him, he has body, soul, his soul has rebirth. People had all these kinds of notions, some beliefs on death, and none of those beliefs could be proven. They were just belief systems. But come science, people began to approach death as a technical problem. So science made people look at death not as some supernatural event, but as a technical problem. If you are dying, there should be a cause, a heart attack, a cancer, some infection. And if you have heart attack, science has a prescription. Yes, your heart failed for so and so reason. Some plaque formed, you had a block, one of your arteries was blocked, there was a clot, the clot blocked the artery and that gave a stroke. So there is an explanation. You have cancer, they have various types of cancers, they tell you how the tumor is growing, which stage you are in. So the science made us look at death in terms of a technical issue. Something is technically wrong with your body, hence you are dying. So this made them address this issue of death to some technical solution. What if we get the technology right? What if we have a cure? So cure for cancer, cure for heart ailment, cure for maybe even aging. If somebody is still healthy, he may ultimately die of aging. So they are now working on identifying what is the reason behind aging. There are some genes that are responsible for aging. What if we can retune or reprogram those genes? Can we stop aging? Can we slow down aging? All these are latest focus of scientific research. So some scholars suggest that by 2050 humans will become what we call as immortal, not immortal, because we can still die of road accident, we may still die of falling from a building or jumping from a cliff, but we may become immortal in the sense that we may not die of bodily failure. We may die of other reasons, but we may not die of illness or failure of the body. So that is how science is now trying to push barriers. Of course, if you still have interest in the subject, you can read this book called Gene by an Indian doctor, Siddhartha Mukherjee. He is an Indian doctor settled in the US, Indian American doctor who is a professor in Harvard Medical School, and he wrote a book called Gene, which became very popular, and half the book talks about the latest advances that biotechnology is making. So his book deals with the range of research ideas that biotechnology is taking up, and a very brilliant book. So if you have time, please go through this. Next, so we discussed science and we said it's very good. So what does it take for science? Does science operate in vacuum? What do you think? Do you think science is free from every bias that society has? Science, ultimately, what fuels science is funding, isn't it? Charles Darwin could go on that voyage from London to some islands on the Chilean coast, the Galapagos Islands, and study those pristine species and come up with the law of natural selection, because the King of London had the money to fund Darwin's research. So many scientists, behind the research that many scientists do, there is enormous funding. Now who gives this funding? Rich donors, corporations, governments, all of them give funding. Now will these agencies give funding without any motive? What do you think? So science requires funding. Funding is given by some people, corporations, governments, some rich donors. What do they fund? Do they fund pure research? Certainly not. All of them fund scientific research that they think will help them, that they think will have commercial value. So if there are two scientists, one scientist want to study whether cows which are being raised in dairy, what is their happiness. Another scientist wants to study a technology that will improve the yield of these cows, that will improve the yield and hence the profits of dairy industry. Which project will get funding? The second, because second has commercial value, first has no commercial value. Why is the dairy industry, the dairy corporations, what do they care about happiness of cows? It doesn't give them money. So science does not exist in a vacuum. Science exists in society. In that sense, science is controlled by the other non-scientific entities that surround it. So which project is funded? Which scientific enterprise, scientific question must be explored? Which science must receive more funding? All of these are not addressed in a scientific way. They are addressed based on the prevailing social, economic and political values of a given society. So science is very good, but science has to live and work with non-scientific and in a non-scientific ecosystem that is determined by our political, economic and religious affairs. So science does not exist in isolation, and science is controlled by the social, economic and political environment that surrounds it. To understand this, just take up the enormous progress that we made in nuclear research during post the Second World War. Why did nuclear research get so much more funding than say some mental health or than psychology? Because nuclear weapons gave nations huge power asymmetry in the Cold War period. A nation that had nuclear weapons was almost untouchable. Take the case of India. Even before we talked about removing poverty, even before we could make gains in health and education, we procured nuclear weapons. Why was that? That was because they were seen as some power balance instruments. So in that sense, the ultimate conclusion is that science is great, science made us superior and gave us enormous power, but science is still, the priorities of science are not determined by science itself, but the priorities of science are determined by non-scientific aspects that operate around the science. So this is how scientific revolution took off. In the next video, we will discuss the aspects, the applied aspects of science, that is the industrial revolution, and how that changed economy as we know it. Thank you.